When people hear the words President of Russia, most think of only one man, Vladimir Putin. Some may remember that for a short period of time there was also Dmitry Medvedev. But before them there was another president, the very first president of modern Russia. His name was Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin came to power in 1991 at one of the most dramatic moments in Russian history. The Soviet Union had just collapsed.
Здравствуйте, в эфире Вести. СССР больше нет. Республики бывшей державы, за исключением Грузии и стран Балтии, их 11, учредили Содружество независимых государств. Границы будут открытыми. Контроль за ядерными вооружениями единый. Кресло в Совете Безопасности ООН вместо СССР занимает Россия.
Boris Yeltsin is a deeply controversial historical figure. In Europe and the United States, he is often remembered as the man who destroyed the hostile Soviet system, opened Russia to the world, and introduced democracy. Inside Russia, his image is very different. He was mocked as an alcoholic who drank the country away. For many Russians, the 1990s are remembered as a time of humiliation, poverty, crime, and chaos. So who was Boris Yeltsin really? A liberator or a national tragedy? To answer that question, we need to go back to the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin was born in 1931 and built a completely typical Soviet career. He was an engineer, a party member, and eventually a powerful regional official in the Communist Party. For years, he was part of the system. But in the late 1980s, during Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, Yeltsin did something almost unthinkable. He openly criticized the communist elite. He attacked corruption, privilege, and hypocrisy inside the party. In the Soviet Union, this was dangerous. Yeltsin was removed from high office and publicly humiliated. The political establishment expected him to disappear. Instead, the opposite happened. The more the system tried to silence him, the more popular he became among ordinary people. By 1990, the Soviet Union was already falling apart. The economy was collapsing, and the republics wanted independence. Yeltsin became the chairman of the Russian parliament, Russia still officially part of the USSR, but increasingly acting on its own. Then came August 1991. A group of hardline Soviet officials attempted a coup to stop reforms and preserve the Soviet Union. Tanks entered Moscow. And then came the image that would define Boris Yeltsin forever. Standing on a tank outside the Russian parliament building, he called on the people and the army to resist the coup. The coup failed, and with it, the Soviet Union effectively died. In June 1991, Boris Yeltsin was elected President of Russia in the country's first ever popular presidential election. By December, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. Russia became an independent state overnight. But independence did not bring stability. Yeltsin inherited a country with no functioning market economy, no democratic institutions, no clear laws, and a population that had never lived outside a centralized authoritarian system. The Russian government had almost no money. Factories stopped working. The ruble collapsed. Savings disappeared. Yeltsin and his team believed there was only one solution. They chose a radical approach known as shock therapy. Prices were liberalized almost overnight. State control over the economy vanished. Mass privatization began. The goal was to rapidly transform Russia into a capitalist democracy. The result was economic shock on a scale few countries have experienced. Inflation exploded. Millions lost their life savings. Poverty skyrocketed. At the same time, vast amounts of state property were sold, often for a fraction of their real value. This is how Russia's oligarchs were born. For some, the 1990s were a time of unprecedented opportunity. For most Russians, they were a daily struggle to survive. While the economy collapsed, the political system also began to break down. Russia was still operating under a Soviet-era constitution. Power was split between the president and parliament. Neither side had clear authority. parliament increasingly opposed Yeltsin's reforms, accusing him of destroying the country and ruling by decree. Yeltsin accused parliament of trying to reverse history and restore the Soviet system. By 1993, Russia was paralyzed. In September, Yeltsin made a decision that would change the country forever. He dissolved parliament by presidential decree.
В соответствии с указом президента, который уже подписан, с сегодняшнего дня прерывается осуществление законодательной, распорядительной и контрольной функций Съезда народных депутатов и Верховного Совета Российской Федерации. Заседания съезда более не созываются. Полномочия народных депутатов Российской Федерации прекращаются. Конечно, их трудовые права будут полностью гарантированы. Депутаты вправе вернуться на предприятия и учреждения, где они работали до избрания депутатами России.
Under the constitution, he had no legal right to do so. Parliament responded by impeaching Yeltsin and declaring the vice president the new head of state. Russia now had two governments, each claiming legitimacy. In October 1993, the crisis turned violent. Armed supporters of parliament clashed with police. Yeltsin ordered the army into Moscow. On October 4th, Russian tanks fired on the parliament building. This was not a foreign invasion. It was the Russian army firing on its own legislature. Hundreds were killed. Yeltsin emerged victorious. A new constitution was adopted, granting the president enormous powers that still define the Russian political system today.
Здравствуйте. Ну, как-то бы ответили бы.
Another defining moment of Yeltsin's presidency was the war in Chechnya. In the mid-1990s, Chechnya attempted to break away from Russia. Yeltsin responded with military force. The war was brutal and poorly planned. The army was unprepared. Public support for the war collapsed.
Мы просили 2 танка вчера, всего 2 танка, чтобы... И сегодня бы мы не отправляли 23 гроба. Их было бы, бля, в половину меньше. 2 танка просили. С 10 утра до 6 вечера я просил 2 танка. Вот нам сказал, товарищ Тихомиров, пусть знает, что нам 2 танка пожалели вчера. Из-за этого мы, 23 уже трупа имеем. 30 мы еще не нашли, 30 наших ребят. А мы все офицеры. Сегодня мы отправили парня одного, у которого 2 грудных ребенка, 2 близнеца. Они сироты. И этот Тихомиров, ни Петров, ни Иванов, ни Ельцин, ни знает кто, блядь, они позаботятся о них.
By 1996, it was clear that Russia could not achieve a military victory. That summer, Yeltsin made a surprising move. He agreed to negotiations. In the Kremlin, he met with Zelimkhan Yandarbiev, one of the leaders of Chechnya, a man Moscow officially considered a rebel. The meeting was symbolic and controversial. For the first time, the Russian president sat face-to-face with a Chechen leader as a political equal.
Yandarbiev was 2 hours late for the meeting. According to protocol, Yeltsin should sit at the head of the table, with the Russian delegation on the right and the Chechen delegation on the left. Yandarbiev was displeased and wanted to sit across from Yeltsin.
Ничего хорошего.
Ну, такого не бывает. Ну, такого, если не бывает, то стоит. Не шучу, потому что я стою. Я приехал на встречу с президентом. Они на комиссию.
Yeltsin came out a few minutes later. There were no handshakes. He took his seat in accordance with protocol. Yandarbiev tried to sit opposite him, thereby giving the meeting the status of an intergovernmental negotiation. The talks could collapse at any moment.
Вот давайте поговорим.
Я приехал с вами решать вопрос. Я согласен с вами решать.
Мы не равны с вами. Мы не равны с вами.
Если даже вы не равны, мы должны это решить. Потому
Мы не
что
равны с
это может
вами.
решить этот вопрос.
Садитесь. Садитесь. Садитесь.
Борис Николаевич, я таким тоном не сяду.
Садитесь.
Я не сяду.
Нормальный тон.
Давайте
Садитесь.
мы поговорим один на один.
Нет, один на один мы не поговорим.
Если тогда я вообще буду.
Садитесь,
Я
пожалуйста.
не сяду. Вы можете меня советовать. Что лучше воевать? Все. Я не терплю таких рассказов. Если это присуще для российского руководства, тогда это другой вопрос. Для меня это не присуще. Все.
Вы не пьете.
Обеспечьте нам, пожалуйста, с вашей гарантией выезда.
Есть документ, который нам надо подписать. Вот он будет подписан сегодня.
Ну, если мы не договоримся, никакой документ не будет.
Ну как?
Ну как?
Надо, чтобы прекратить кровь, поэтому
Мы хотим этого. Я
хватит, отвоевались. Отвоевались.
Я хочу с вами поговорить.
Отвоевались.
Я думаю, что вы потом будете
Отвоевались.
выигрыши.
Yandarbiyev got his way after all, and Yeltsin invited him to sit opposite him.
Никто еще не посмел президенту России опоздать хотя бы на 5 минут.
Ну, к сожалению, не по нашей
Вот так.
вине, но мы приносим
А не 2 часа с половиной. Вы понимаете?
Мы еще раз приносим свои извинения, но повторяем, это не по нашей вине.
Ну, это я, если бы это поменять каких-то наших служб, то с этим я разберусь.
Soon after, Russia signed the Khasavyurt Accords, ending the First Chechen War. The agreement did not solve the conflict, it only postponed it. By the mid-1990s, Boris Yeltsin had become not only a controversial leader inside Russia, but also a symbol of unpredictability abroad. His personal behavior increasingly affected how Russia was perceived on the world stage. One of the most famous incidents happened in 1994, during an official visit to Ireland. Yeltsin's presidential plane landed at Shannon Airport. The Irish Prime Minister was waiting on the runway to greet him, but Yeltsin never came out of the plane. After a long delay, Russian officials explained that the president was not feeling well. The meeting was cancelled. Western media quickly reported what many already suspected, that Yeltsin was too drunk to appear in public. The incident became international news and deeply embarrassed the Russian government. But this was not an isolated case.
Я спас тогда честь России. Он был не готов к этой встрече.
Скажу честно, я просто проспал 18 часов в полете. До этого, понимаешь, значит, столько не спал. А служба безопасности не пустила тех людей, которые, так сказать, должны меня были разбудить. Я, конечно, разберусь, им врежу как следует.
Это
Yeltsin's relationship with the West, especially with the United States, was deeply personal. Nowhere was this more visible than in his interactions with President Bill Clinton. Clinton strongly supported Yeltsin, seeing him as the guarantor of democratic reforms in Russia. Their meetings were often unusually informal. They joked together, they laughed openly. At times, they appeared less like two presidents and more like old friends. In one famous moment at the White House, Yeltsin laughed loudly alongside Clinton, relaxed and carefree, while cameras rolled. For Western audiences, this symbolized a new era. Russia was no longer an enemy. The Cold War was over.
Уважаемые дамы и господа,
Dear ladies and gentlemen,
уважаемые журналисты,
dear journalists,
во-первых, я должен сказать, что я ехал сюда на эту встречу по приглашению президента Соединенных Штатов Билла Клинтона не с таким оптимизмом, который сейчас у меня имеется.
I want to say, first of all, that when I came here to the United States for this visit at the invitation of the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, I did not at that time have the degree of optimism with which I now am departing.
И это все из-за вас, потому что даже в сегодняшних всех газетах, опираясь на вчерашнее выступление в Организации Объединенных Наций, вы пререкли, что наша встреча сегодня, она провалится.
And this is all due to you, because coming from my statement yesterday in the United Nations, and if you looked at the press reports, one could see that what you were writing was that today's meeting with President Bill Clinton was going to be a disaster.
Так вот, не первый раз я вам говорю, что вы провалились.
Well, now for the first time I can tell you that you're a disaster.
Be sure you get the right attribution there.
Я надеюсь, что вы правильно все это поняли.
Inside Russia, however, these images were perceived very differently. Many Russians saw not friendship, but humiliation. A powerful country reduced to dependence. A president who seemed more comfortable joking in Washington than solving problems at home. For supporters of Yeltsin, these moments represented openness and trust. For his critics, they were proof of weakness and loss of dignity. By the end of the 1990s, Boris Yeltsin was exhausted, politically, physically, and personally. His health deteriorated. Alcohol abuse became a public topic. His approval ratings collapsed. Yet in 1996, he still won re-election, with massive media support and the backing of powerful oligarchs. Democracy survived, but in a deeply distorted form. On December 31, 1999, Boris Yeltsin addressed the nation. He apologized, and then he resigned.
Я ухожу. Я сделал все, что мог. Мне на смену приходит новое поколение, поколение тех, кто может сделать больше и лучше. В соответствии с Конституцией, уходя в отставку, я подписал указ о возложении обязанностей президента России на председателя правительства Владимира Владимировича Путина. В течение 3 месяцев он будет главой государства, а через 3 месяца, также в соответствии с Конституцией, состоятся выборы президента. Я хочу сказать каждому из вас: будьте счастливы. Вы заслужили счастье. Вы заслужили счастье и спокойствие. С Новым годом, с Новым веком, дорогие мои.
Владимир Путин 51,2%. Геннадий Зюганов 28,4%. Мы видим, что данные по Зюганову чуть-чуть расходятся, как и данные по Путину, но это не принципиально.
Мой процент.
У Григория Глинского...
Мой процент.
Владимиру Владимировичу позвонить.
Позвоним. Подожди, я сам. Мне бы Владимира Владимировича Путина. Ладно, я положу трубку. Сейчас позвоним.
Нет, все-таки еще неизвестно.
Известно.
Ну как известно?
Что известно?
Что
Уже
Владимир
избран
Владимирович победил?
Владимир Владимирович победил.
Не знаю.
Забегая вперед, скажу, что Борис Ельцин в нашем присутствии так и не дождался ответного звонка Путина.
Свободные выборы, свободу России, свободу средств массовой информации. Если Путин победит, то свобода средств массовой информации будет обеспечена, безусловно.
Будем надеяться. Спасибо, Борис Николаевич.
Куда ни ткни.
Везде.
Более стоит.
А гимн возвращали без вас? И даже новый текст его совсем не спасает.
Красивенько.
Power was transferred to a former intelligence officer and prime minister, Vladimir Putin. Yeltsin believed he was leaving behind a democratic Russia. History would judge that differently.